What is ayahuasca and what is it good for treating?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Ayahuasca is a traditional plant medicine um, originating in the Amazon of South America, the Amazonian region. It is a holistic medicine that has many healing applications, dealing with psychological, physical, emotional, and spiritual illnesses and conditions. In the area of psychological conditions and illnesses, ayahuasca is perhaps the most effective treatment for depression known because it addresses that condition on both a biochemical, physiological, and psychological levels, and providing an opportunity for deep introspection and kind of self-psychoanalysis as to the root causes of the depression. It also seems to have a normalization effect on the serotonin function in the brain, normalizing serotonin production and function. And that, of course, rather quickly alleviates the emotional feelings associated with depression, feelings of hopelessness, despair, and constant sadness, feelings of that nature. So the emotional responses to the depression state is relieved rather quickly. And the fact that ayahuasca seems to normalize the natural endogenous serotonin function seems to account for the long-lasting benefits. And in many cases, people having suffered depression for long periods of time, having a long history of use of pharmaceutical antidepressants, after working with ayahuasca, find that they do not go back to those feelings and they experience a permanent relief from that condition. Same is true for anxiety issues, phobias of various types, irrational fears of things, stress and trauma disorders, examples being childhood trauma issues, often involving such events as sexual abuse, things of that nature, as a child, as well as traumatic incidents and impacts resulting from military service, post-traumatic stress disorder, and things of this nature. Those on the psycho-spiritual end of the spectrum. In terms of physical conditions that have been shown to be improved through ayahuasca therapy in many cases. There are many accounts of remissions of various types of cancer following work with ayahuasca usually in a more extensive manner, often involving multiple cycles of work followed by periods of integration and recuperation and recovery and progressive improvement. Probably the most profound improvements in physical conditions that we've seen in our work are with people with Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis. Neurophysiological disorders in general seem to be improved rather quickly, at least symptomatically, through even short-term medication with ayahuasca, with the ayahuasca medicine. So these are some examples of things that can be at least anecdotally verified. In all of these cases, there are bodies of biomedical study and research ongoing to investigate the actual mechanisms of healing involved in these processes, to understand that better from a scientific perspective. But in many respects, science is kind of catching up with traditional medicine in terms of providing the proof, if you will, based on scientific method and evaluation, to provide the convincing evidence to the satisfaction of the Western mind that this plant in particular and related plants associated with it do indeed have remarkable healing properties that have great potential in service to humanity and in dealing with things that modern conventional pharmaceutical medicine does not address well, if at all. Serious healing and spiritual work with ayahuasca requires preparation. And that preparation must focus both on, perhaps first and foremost, on intention. That is to say, the reasons why a person wants to undertake the process. It's important to understand that work with ayahuasca is a process and not a singular event. All of the benefits of ayahuasca cannot be realized in a single session, or in many cases even a single cycle of work. But the effective way to work with ayahuasca is prescribed in traditional shamanic practice as a cycle or a series of ceremonies that are usually progressively conducted with particular focus on the condition or needs of the participants present, the patients, if you will. And the most important aspect of preparation is to focus first on forming some form of intention, which in general I think should be broadly based. A good way to define intention, I think, is to think of one's intention as a mission statement for your life. And then within that you might have goals or objectives in how you wish to achieve that mission in your life. And that might involve certain things that you're seeking in the form of personal healing, guidance, spiritual realization, whatever one feels they are lacking in their life that they would like to fill. So the preparations are very important before one engages in a ceremony. There are also preparations that should be undertaken immediately prior to going into ceremony to prepare the participant for the possible events that might unfold, both with themselves and with others present in the ceremony. Guidance in ceremonial protocol and proper conduct, how to hold and move the energy of the medicine as it unfolds for each individual, which will generally be very different from person to person. And the interesting thing about ayahuasca is that it rarely is the same two times consecutively. It almost always is different each time in substantive and qualitative ways. The nature of the experience may range from mild to extremely intense, and that might polarize from one ceremony to the next. In other words, a person might have a very mild experience one time, and the next ceremony, drinking the same medicine in the same amount, they might have an extremely intense ceremony that's often pushes them to their limits. So ayahuasca is very unpredictable in that way, and in many respects it very much interacts with the energy of the individual at the time they take the medicine, which is the principal variable involved. That actually is a much more definitive factor than dosage by itself. Some people have a very low threshold of sensitivity to ayahuasca and consequently may have very strong or even overwhelming experiences with just a very small amount of medicine. Others may have a high threshold of sensitivity and require more medicine, at least in the initial stages of their work with it, in order to get the breakthrough. Usually after a breakthrough occurs, though, a person finds that connection, and then the typical pattern is that people who are less experienced with ayahuasca generally need to drink more than people who have more experience with it. Because as a teacher plant, it teaches one how to access these realms of consciousness and the inner guide, the deeper instruction that goes beyond the mind and beyond the individual ego to connect with something more profound than ourselves. Discernment in the ayahuasca experience is very important as well, and by that I refer to the ability to distinguish between an activation of one's egoic desires or wishes, which may be seemingly authorized or fulfilled in the course of the ceremony, and on the other hand, receiving deep spiritual guidance from another source, which many people refer to as having the conversation with Mother Ayahuasca. Whether that information is coming from ayahuasca or from a more profound source than ayahuasca is an open question, but we regard ayahuasca as to be a channeler of higher consciousness coming from the supreme source, and the plant is a channel or a conductor of that teaching and that energy, which is the primary agent of healing through the process. That doesn't come from the curandero, but it may come through the curandero as a co-channeler in the conducting of the ceremony and working with the plant. That would depend on the depth of connection of the practitioner with the plant, based on their own experience and their own personal relationship with it. That's the essence of shamanic training. And typically the typical duration of a diligent apprenticeship in the practice of Amazonian shamanism is 8 to 10 years before one is considered to be qualified and authorized to conduct ceremony on their own, independent of their maestro, who provided the human guidance and instruction in that apprenticeship process. Learning the art of ayahuasca shamanism nearly always requires a human maestro, one who has gone before and has attained a level of knowledge and mastery that they are then able to communicate, in most cases, through guided experience more than through oral exchange, although both of those may be involved in the process. But it's mostly learned by participation, observation, assistance, and, as I like to say, not sleeping in class. That is, when in ceremony and whether in ceremony or out of ceremony, remaining focused and concentrating on what you're learning from the plant and through the process. And that's cumulative. One learns that a little at a time over a long period of time. And it's not something that one can really learn and become a proficient in through a crash course. There's really no such thing as an instant shaman. That's for the most part, a Western fantasy and a wishful thinking. In order to gain qualifications to practice traditional medicine, the first priority is to complete your own personal work in terms of your own healing and your own evolution to a sufficient level so that you are fit to serve, as it were. You have to pass the fitness test before you're able to be of service to others, which is true in anything. So that's the process. It's not as easy as many think or as many would like it to be, but it is what it is. And the traditional patterns of progression, training, and apprenticeship, and the importance of dietas in that training process in order to gain knowledge and proficiency in not just ayahuasca, the master plant, but also the myriad of other medicinal plants that are often used in association with ayahuasca. One of the reasons ayahuasca is called a master plant is because it is, in many cases, a key potentiator of the medicine of other plants. So for that reason, many plants are used in conjunction with ayahuasca that are specific to the healing needs of a particular patient. And there are two ways that can be done. One is to incorporate that admixture plant or secondary medicinal plant in the ayahuasca medicine itself. And the other is to administer it separately, but in conjunction with a cycle of ayahuasca, the ayahuasca serving to open the energy of the patient, to make them more receptive to the healing energy of the medicinal plant. And it also has the effect of potentiating the energy of the other plant as well. So one of the key roles of ayahuasca in its relationship both to humans and to other plants is as potentiator, to open and intensify and potentiate the energy and the energetic connection. In many ways, one could describe ayahuasca as an energy medicine and its effect on the dynamic, holistic energy of the individual. And it has a dynamic effect, interaction with the energy around it as well, which of course is one of the reasons why careful attention to setting, that is the place, space, and company in which one partakes of ayahuasca, because of that heightened energetic reception. One wants to have a very clean, energetic space in which to engage work with ayahuasca. So, in ayahuasca practice, there is, in traditional practice, a strong emphasis on protection, going into and coming out of ceremony. That is largely metaphysical in nature. There's a psychosomatic component to the protection as well, but that serves to relieve certain anxieties that some people have about being rendered vulnerable to external negative forces or energies when under the influence of ayahuasca, and certainly that is true to one degree. But the spiritual protection shields one from that, from external influences, and enables one to work with whatever negative impressions or energy that may come up with the individual, to understand that to be coming from within themselves rather than representing a psychic attack or some kind of negative energy being directed toward them from some outside source. But the protection is very, very important. Generally, that's provided to each individual in the ayahuasca ceremony in the form of a special icaro called an arcana. And the presiding curandero will go to each participant in the ceremony and administer the arcana, which provides that personal protection. And then after everyone is partaken of the medicine, then the presiding curanderos will go outside and around the perimeter of the ceremonial space, and using mapacho for its protective energy, set up a protective zone around the entire ceremonial area to further provide that protection and security. And that tends to often put people's mind at ease a little more, kind of lowers the anxiety and apprehension, and just provides a sense of security and comfort that is very important in finding the courage and the strength to surrender to the medicine. It's very hard for people to do that usually in their early relationship with it, because in many cases ayahuasca can be very intimidating in one way or another. And there often is a sort of a defensive response many people have to close up or kind of pull back from the threshold when they feel themselves coming into something where they're being overpowered or overwhelmed or losing their sense of self-control. So trust is essential, and consequently the security and trustworthiness of the setting that one is working in, the people one is working with, the competence and integrity of those guiding the work and escorting people into this sacred space is very important to raising that trust. It's something that has to be cultivated. Usually people don't have a sufficient amount of that in their first encounter, or sometimes several. It takes sometimes several times to gain enough trust and enough courage to fully surrender and release to the medicine. But that's really necessary to get the fullest benefits from it. In one's work with ayahuasca, there are two principal phases of the work. Three, if you consider the preliminary preparation that I've spoken of, the holistic preparation. The second phase, of course, is the intensive phase. The intensive phase is the ceremonial experience, the experience one has when one partakes of ayahuasca. And when one is in that phase of the relationship, it's very important to be in a very open, receptive mode or attitude. Many people have very strong expectations of what they expect ayahuasca to be like based on what they've read, what they've heard, what they've seen on the internet, and so forth. And while ayahuasca experience does generally fall into several definable categories of experience, no two ayahuasca experiences are exactly the same in the same individual. And every individual's ayahuasca experiences are fundamentally unique to them, in as much as they are composed of that individual's personal life experience, as well as their personality, their energetic nature, their relationship with their ego, the nature of their ego, their degree of attachments, the nature of their socialization, to some degree. The nature of their educational background can influence that reception or perception of the ayahuasca experience. So the intensive phase is what you might call the download phase, the phase of the relationship in which you are receiving information and receiving energy that, if properly focused, and if one's personal openness and intention is appropriate, will usually result in positive input, positive results, either in the area of physical or psychological healing, or sometimes through the acquisition of important guiding insights that are beneficial in one's life. So those things are received primarily in the intensive phase, but most of what is received is not perceived at the same time. Some of it's perceived as it comes in, but often there's such an energetic overload that's so complex and coming in through different avenues that most people cannot effectively process an ayahuasca experience while they're experiencing it. So the third phase of one's relationship with ayahuasca is actually the most important phase of the three, and that's the phase we call integration. And integration is the processing and the realization of what one has received in the intensive phase. And integration is an open-ended process. Typically, one begins to integrate ayahuasca immediately coming out of a ceremony. A certain amount of integration starts at that point. But there's usually a 24 to 48 hour period where full recovery of recollection of a lot of the details of what one has experienced in the ceremony are still a bit hazy and unclear. So it sometimes takes a little time before some of those things begin to come back in and kind of come into the realm of one's ordinary consciousness, where they can begin to contemplate what it all means and what benefits are beginning to unfold. Often the benefits are not immediately evident, and that's especially true for people who are coming to ayahuasca primarily for the experience of it rather than for the resulting benefits of it. In our work, as in all healing modalities, our focus is on results. And our focus is on instruction in the principles and concepts of classical shamanism, as well as guidance and facilitation of the healing benefits and instructional benefits of the plants as teachers and healers. So these are connections that some people are able to connect with more quickly than others. But most people require a certain amount of deprogramming and guidance, the deprogramming being to kind of unravel some of the preconceived notions that people increasingly have about this, that in many cases are simply not true and incorrect, or are based on unrealistic expectations. Many people expect ayahuasca to produce instant results, as if it's a magic elixir that, when taken, heals everything and solves everyone's problems in an instant, in one epiphanic moment, as it were. And that is rarely, if ever, the case, actually. Ayahuasca certainly has healing properties that directly affect a rather wide range of conditions that are not effectively treated by Western medicine. There are also some things that Western medicine still seems to work better than ayahuasca does. So working with ayahuasca is something that should be understood, not to necessarily fix everything that you feel you have wrong with you, but it is going to address those things that it works well for. And in many cases, it will initiate a healing process that will unfold step by step and eventually lead one to resolution of those physical or psychological conditions, or awaken one to certain realities that perhaps they have not been aware of up to that point, often of a spiritual nature. Let me continue on for just a minute on integration, if you don't mind. Just one more comment on the subject of integration, because it's so important. The focus on integration is commonly underestimated, and many people do not give sufficient importance to that aspect of the process. That's especially true for people who are motivated to a great extent by the experience of the medicine in ceremony, as opposed to the longer term benefits and results. But the integration process is open-ended, and for most people, a minimum of 60 days is really necessary to really effectively integrate a good cycle of work with ayahuasca, and that is best done in a quiet, natural setting as much as possible. But there's often no benefit to going back into ceremony too quickly, following a good cycle of work until that sufficient amount of integration has occurred. And usually people know when it's time to do it again, if they feel called to do it again. But the spacing, intensive cycles of 4 or 5 ceremonies is sufficient. Often more than that is actually can become a point of diminishing return if one takes too much ayahuasca in a short period of time. Sometimes there's a point where no greater benefit is being realized, and actually one can regress a bit just by getting too infatuated with being in the experience too much. There's a point when you're topped off, and when you're topped off, it's like filling a glass with water. When the glass is full, you can't get more water in it. If you pour more water in a full glass, it just spills out. And that's a good analogy for how ayahuasca is after one is full for the time being. You have to digest a little of that before there's room to put more in. So good spacing, intensive cycle, followed by I would say a minimum of 30 days and preferably 60 days of integration before coming back and doing it again. And longer integration is often even more effective, because that integrated process can actually go on for years. I got an email from a guy in Hawaii who was here with me 18 years ago, and I just got an email from him yesterday telling me how how much the medicine is still working in his life, and expressing his gratitude for the treatment he received with it 18 years ago, just to give you an idea of the longevity of the effectiveness. And he's not had ayahuasca since. So that gives you an idea of the enduring benefits and qualities that one can realize from it. My name is Howard Lawler. I grew up in the rural areas of Kentucky in North America. My interest in shamanism began very early in my life as a child, coming from unlikely roots. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky where my grandmother was a renowned healer and was known in those parts as a Kentucky root doctor, which was simply a country name for an herbalist person knowledgeable in the use of plants for making medicine, for various other purposes as well. So I was exposed to that interaction with plants very early in my life. I spent a lot of time on my grandmother's farm, watching her practice her art with the local community. People would come to her for healing various kinds of conditions, some of a spiritual nature, some of a physical nature. If the need was physical, she would evaluate the person and then decide what kind of plant would be useful in treating that condition. And she would go out in the woods or out in the fields and find the plant and make the medicine and then administer it to the person in a very interesting way, very similar to the style and approach that is used here in the Peruvian Amazon in traditional healing with plants here. An integral part of her healing process was prayer. She was a prayer healer as well. So when she administered her plant medicine, she would always do it with a prayer, a very intense concentration of healing energy. All of that done in a very fundamentalist Christian modality, but nonetheless using the same kind of energy and focus in combination with the medicinal properties of the plants, as we see being done here traditionally in the Peruvian Amazon and indeed in other parts of Peru as well. So this established an orientation for me regarding the use of plants as medicine, and it also reinforced my natural reverence and perception of nature as sacred, and all of that really became a guiding force in my life and in my future development. Of course, when I was a child, I had no knowledge of shamanism per se. I didn't know what the word meant. I never heard the word mentioned. But my grandmother would tell me stories of how she learned about medicinal plants from her grandmother, who was a full-blood Cherokee Shawnee Native American. So that inspired a keen interest in Native American culture, in as much as that was part of my own heritage, which I began to study, learn more and more about. And in the course of those studies, I very quickly began to become aware of the core principles of Native American spirituality, which is universally held by indigenous people all over the world. That being fundamentally a reverence and respect for the earth as our sacred mother, and a concept or reverence for an all-encompassing collective consciousness, which was often referred to as the Great Spirit. So these were concepts that resonated very deeply with me naturally. It all seemed perfectly in sync with my own perspectives and perceptions of the world around me that was emerging as a child, as my own spiritual consciousness was beginning to unfold. And so coming out of that fundamentalist Christian cultural foundation, I began to evolve, and I began to find avenues of spirituality beyond the confines of religiosity, as it were. And that is where I began to explore and began to understand the principles and concepts of universal shamanism, and realizing that this was not something that was limited only to existing indigenous cultures and people, but indeed is part of the heritage of all people from all walks of life in all parts of the world. Anyone tracing their own cultural and genetic ancestry back far enough would find their own roots in some form of a shamanic culture or shamanic practice if they go back far enough. So finding that root in my own life, in my own trajectory, has given me not only a sense of where I'm coming from, but where I am and indeed where I'm going in my own spiritual journey, from my spiritual birthing to full realization of the spiritual reality in which I now reside, here in my earthly experience as a human being, and a sense of spiritual destiny and what lies beyond this level when the time comes to move on to the next world. Well, over the time, from the time I began to have my awakening in my late teens, I continued my studies of shamanism and Native American culture and spirituality. That led me fairly quickly to a realization that certain plants have been employed by indigenous people and indigenous cultures as part of their ceremonial relationship with the natural world, with the cosmos. So the first sacred plant that I came in contact with was peyote in the Native American church tradition. That's where I began my practice and my relationship with the sacred plants. And that work continued for several years' time, which led me to similar types of connection and work with other sacred plants, including the sacred mushroom of Mexico, and also the plant most widely known as San Pedro, properly referred to in its older pre-Columbian name as Wachuma, which became my primary modality of shamanic practice by the time I was in my mid to late 20s. And I continued to work in that modality, evolving, continually moving back in time from the post-colonial practices that were highly Christianized, influenced by Catholicism, going back into the pre-Columbian period, where the practices were more pure, more direct, more pagan, if you will, and more unencumbered by dogma and elements of religiosity. So in the early 90s, I had the opportunity to come to Peru at the invitation of an old friend who was doing research in tropical biology here in Peru. And because I, too, have a background in tropical biology, he invited me to come down here and assist him in some of his work here in that arena, which, upon invitation, I gleefully accepted, not only because of my passion for nature and natural history and the natural world, but because that also opened a door to engage another modality of core shamanism that I had up to that time not had the opportunity to make connection with, which is the Amazonian practices involving ayahuasca. So I came here in the early 90s. My first mission in my connection with ayahuasca was actually for my own personal healing of acute chronic depression, which I'd fallen into a few years prior to that period of time. And fortuitously, I was able to find a very, very good, ethical, competent, experienced curandera to take me under her wing and facilitate my own healing process of that condition with ayahuasca, which produced amazing results in a very short period of time. essentially healing my depression in just a course of just a few ceremonies. And through that, I saw the huge potential of this to help a lot of people. This, of course, was long before ayahuasca was a household word. Very few people knew anything at all about shamanism or had any real interest in shamanism or shamanic healing or any aspect of that. And ayahuasca was still at that point virtually unknown to the Western world, except in a few esoteric circles. So as a result of my own blessings received through that process, and because of the background that I had in the practice of shamanism and my previous studies and work with other sacred plants, I realized I had some qualities that lent themselves well to becoming a bridge to help other people find the same connection who had the same kinds of needs as I had for personal healing, spiritual growth and development, and so forth. So in 1995, I established the Ayahuasca Spirit Quest Healing and Higher Consciousness program here in the Amazon, here in the Iquitos area. It was at that time one of only 3 organized opportunities for that kind of connection available here. And at that time, there was no such thing as ayahuasca tourism. There was no global thrust or attraction for this, for people to come here. So people who came back in the early 90s and mid-90s were people who were relatively well-versed seekers who had done their own homework, as it were, and knew a little bit about the nature of ayahuasca as a healing medicine, and were coming almost exclusively for the healing properties of the medicine at that time. And so that began in 1995. From that point forward, I have conducted our Ayahuasca Spirit Quest healing retreats every month since 1995 to the present. Ayahuasca is a plant which opens many avenues and dimensions of consciousness. The thing that most people do not anticipate with ayahuasca is the opening of everything, including those things about themselves, conditions that may be subliminal to their conscious awareness, which are affecting their lives in various ways, some of which are positive and some of which are negative influences. So ayahuasca is an opener. Ayahuasca is a potentiator. It brings things to the surface that remain, that are often otherwise deeply submerged in the subconscious. It also has a profound effect on the ego in different ways, working in different ways with different people. And in some cases, the ego may be suppressed in certain ways, allowing one to find more profound levels of empathy and connection with people, nature, things in their immediate environment. And in other cases, ayahuasca may inflate the ego, creating delusional perceptions of oneself. Delusions which I often refer to as delusions of grandeur. So when one comes to work with ayahuasca, an appropriate amount of preparation, training, and guidance is extremely helpful, beneficial, indeed for most people essential, in order to open that relationship on a sound footing, to be prepared for some of the surprises that ayahuasca often brings, to prepare people for the unexpected, to help people diminish expectations that are unwarranted. There's a tendency often for people to expect or desire ayahuasca to be what they want it to be, rather than being capable of surrendering to it and allowing it to work as it naturally does, without being influenced by one's ego desires or attempts to control or manipulate it in some way. the perfect state in which to come to work with ayahuasca is a state of complete acceptance, minimal expectations of how the experience is going to unfold, and a willingness to completely surrender to the process. Serious work with ayahuasca is a process that is never completed in a single ceremony, and often not completed in a single cycle of ceremonies. That depends to a great extent on the nature of the individual needs, the individual personality, the individual ego, the degree to which the person can muster sufficient trust and courage in order to surrender fully to it, in order to receive the most from it. And of course, in order to surrender fully, one must be in a setting facilitated by people who are ethical and trustworthy, simply because when one enters the realm of ayahuasca, one willingly submits oneself to a high degree of vulnerability. One becomes very vulnerable under the influence of ayahuasca. So doing it in a trusted setting with trusted people is really essential in order to be able to surrender fully to it and get the fullest benefits from it. Most people have a tendency to think of pleasant experiences as good experiences, and difficult, challenging, or hard experiences as bad experiences. When working with ayahuasca, those criteria are not really legitimate, simply because the very nature of ayahuasca is to bring up things that people would otherwise tend to avoid dealing with. And this is one of the greatest attributes of ayahuasca from the standpoint of personal auto-psychoanalysis, as it were, enabling those issues to come to the surface so that they can be confronted, addressed, and hopefully resolved in the conscious mind, or at least that process initiated. And very often these processes of confrontation are very unpleasant, very difficult, very challenging, and people frequently don't like the process as they are experiencing it in the moment. And so often they're with people who don't have much experience and don't understand the nature of the medicine in this way. They characterize such experiences as bad experiences. In reality, those experiences tend to be the most beneficial in the long run, providing the person is able to allow the process to run its course, to allow those things to come up, to engage in the hard work of processing those revelations or those confrontations. And of course, that really all happens in the course of the ceremony itself. The intensive phase of one's relationship with ayahuasca is what happens in the ceremony, immediately after partaking of the plant medicine and while under its direct influence. But actually, the influence of ayahuasca continues long after the effects seemingly wear off or diminish. And what unfolds at that point is a process of integration. And so the integration begins really sometimes during the intensive phase, but most of the integration, 95% of the integration, occurs after the ceremony is completed, during the interim between the last ceremony and the next ceremony. And a cycle of work with ayahuasca ideally involves a minimum of 3 and generally not more than 5 ceremonies for optimal effectiveness. More than 5 ceremonies may or may not have some added benefit, but for most people, after 4 or 5 ceremonies, the continued benefit of drinking more medicine at that time diminishes sharply, and there can even be a point of diminishing returns where one is actually regressing a bit, especially if they become fixated or fascinated or infatuated with the experience of it themselves, failing to recognize that the experience is actually a means to a greater end and not an end in itself. So this largely comes down to the kind of guidance and preparation a person receives prior to engaging in the intensive work, and then of course the guidance and counsel that they may need in the course of the integration process. most of one's work in relationship with ayahuasca actually unfolds in integration rather than in the intensive work. So we could consider the intensive phase of it to be like a download of a large package of executable files, which are then executed systematically in one's life after the intensive period is concluded. And that's very open-ended. That can go on for months, can continue indefinitely. I've had people work with me here over the years, going back 15, as far back as 20 years, who still contact me now and then and laud the continuing benefits and revelations that they're still receiving after their work here many years ago. So I think this is true in many cases if the work is done well and the person really connects with it and continues to work with it. It's a gift that keeps on giving long after one has taken the medicine.
Okay.